is Diamond Imelda Williams. I'm a PhD student at UMD College Park in the Department of Special Education. Dr. Sarah Shikarpurya is my advisor, and I'm here to talk to you today about culturally relevant education. The full title is In the United States of America. At the end, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means overall. Our agenda for this short time together is we're going to review what it means to check your biases, what it means to get to know your students, go over the definition of culturally relevant education or culturally relevant pedagogy. I'm going to give some book suggestions. I'm going to go over 2 techniques, and then we will end. And that's my motto there: fear not and shine bright. We all have biases. You should say that to yourself. That's why I put it there. It's really important to note, appreciate, and understand. So biases are the hidden, implicit, and open, explicit feelings, assumptions, preferences, and barriers we feel towards others. Taking trainings, reading materials, and doing something like the Harvard IAT, if you just Google that, you'll find it. It's called the implicit association test, can help you identify when those come up for you. So these biases were built into our brains to help us evolutionarily, right? To know that, oh, that berry is bad and this fruit is good, and not to eat this type of food and not to go to that location, right? We're hardwired to keep our bodies safe. But now that we've evolved to a point where we're not in those situations, our body is still hardwired and our brain is still hardwired to identify threats. So these threats could appear something like, maybe because of the society that we live in, you have an implicit fear of poor people. So you think anyone with a lower economic status might be dangerous, right? You might have an association with one of my students brought up in a class, oh, that person is homeless. That means they don't care about education. Stop there. So we had to have that conversation. That might be a bias that we have implicitly that we don't actually know about. These biases could be explicit. Maybe you've had drama with the opposite sex or with the same sex or with someone of a different ethnic group. That trauma could be explicitly make you wary of those type of people. And they come up when we have a feeling. So for example, when I was teaching one of my students, I had a conversation with her. It was a private conversation. I think it was during lunch. And I asked her what she did over Easter break. I'm a Christian. I know that this student identifies as a Christian. So in my head, I already knew that there was an answer I was looking for, right? That's a bias. I have a preference towards what she's going to say to me. She does indeed say, oh, I went to church, we went shopping, right? But that checked on my brain like, oh, that's a good girl, good job. It made me feel closer to her. In the same way, you might hear biases when someone else speaks. So I was having a conversation with a friend recently, sharing about an interaction that I had with a person who I didn't know their race. So I said he was a brown man, a tan man. I'm not sure what his race or ethnicity was. When she was recounting the story again to someone else in my presence, she said, oh, if that Mexican guy shows up again, right? That bothered me because, one, I chose not to identify him racially because I don't know what his race was. But the fact that she chose this race without knowing who this person was, and it was kind of a negative interaction. It wasn't severely negative, but that tells me that there may be some biases that they need to unpack. We all have them, and we need to check our feelings to know when we have them. If something happens and we're like, oh, I didn't like that, ask yourself, why didn't you like that? Why did you feel that way? Because it can indeed impact the way you interact with people who identify with your biases. So check your biases. And this goes to knowing your students well. So knowing your students well is the basis for all classroom management. And Rita Pearson, who's a wonderful educator, she has a TED Talk if you haven't seen it. And she says, we don't learn from people we don't like. Now, your goal is not to be the best friend of your student, but it is to know them well. And it is saddening when you ask your teachers, what do you know about your students? And they don't know their racial identity. They don't know their ethnic identity. They don't know what language they speak at home. They don't know how they celebrate and what cultures they celebrate, right? And holidays, they celebrate. This matters because you can't do culturally relevant education without knowing the cultural context of your student. There are some grounding things, right? You're in a school in America, in a city, right? Or in an urban area, and your school has a culture. So starting there with, if there's homerooms, if there's celebrations that their school celebrates, if you hear the kids talking about things, right? What music they're listening to, I made it a habit of frequently, every week, I would ask my students about themselves in some way, shape, or form. And there are a plethora of techniques to do that, but telling them about you is that first step. There's a nice technique that I learned, and it was a little you put some chart paper up and it says, ask me about, and you put 3 things that you know about. It could be your content area, but of course kids know that, so you might want to get a little deeper. It could be something that you're interested in or that you play, right? If there was a volleyball coach and they played volleyball, they would say, ask me about volleyball. There was a Spanish teacher who was also an artist and she paints. She would ask me about painting. I love to jump rope, so I would write that up. Or I'd like to sing, right? Things like that. If you open yourself up, it can be helpful to get kids to open up as well. And we're also learning and working with students who are neurodivergent, right? So giving them multiple opportunities to share about themselves, including talking to friends and parents and all these things, will help them do that. I put identity chart at the bottom. That's a technique that I used where students would lead students to basically writing about themselves. It's basically a web where you put your name in the middle, and on the outside you put all these different identifiers. I would teach them about invisible characteristics, like I'm a sister, I'm an aunt. Invisible characteristics. I identify as a Black woman. I'm African American. I'm a female. I'm not very tall, but you know what I mean? Something like that. Things that you can see and things that you can't see. So now that you've gotten to know your students, now that you've checked your biases at the door, we can talk about the definition of culturally relevant pedagogy. This is Gloria Ladson-Billings, and the components of culturally relevant pedagogy include 3 things: academic achievement, social political consciousness, and cultural competence. Academic achievement, the reason we're here is to bridge the achievement gap, which has been debated. That's why I put it in quotes and all these things. We want to make our content more relevant to our students so that they achieve academically. That's the goal. Cultural competence, at a webinar recently, Gloria Ladson-Billings stated that we need to be multicultural. I need to know the culture of my student and at least one other culture, and that's an ongoing process. If I have students who are from Honduras, I want to get to know them. I want to know about their culture. If I have a student who's really into My Little Pony, right, and they happen to be a white female, I want to ask them about that and understand what that means to them. If I have an Asian student who has been traumatized because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I want to know about that. I want to be informed, right? If kids are celebrating because they have a bat mitzvah coming up, I want to know about that and be adept at knowing why they're excited, knowing what things are concerning them, knowing what the chatter is about, all of those things. And the final one, social political consciousness, is the one that people are lacking most of. And as Gloria Ladson-Billings says, if you're not doing all 3, you're not really doing all 3. This is about unmasking and unmaking oppressive systems. What's going on in the world around you? How can you bring those conversations into your classroom? And when you're studying something like social studies in particular, or ELA, and you're having all these conversations about context of the text, how does it relate to what students are going on today? And how can you actively have conversations that push the boundaries of power, push the boundaries of access, talk about and humanize people on a regular basis? So some suggestions to do that. Here are some books. So we have Dream Keepers. That was by Gloria Ladson-Billings. She's also written and has a lot of other articles published, so you should just look that up. We've got Zaretta Hammond here. She wrote Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, something I particularly use in terms of working with neurodivergent students. We have Chris Emden, 2 books, For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too, and Ratchetdemic, right? So I didn't necessarily teach in the hood and I'm not white, so I was part of the Rest of Y'all Too. This book has some concrete suggestions, and I'm going to go over a technique that I use to really get to know your students, learn how they learn, engage with them in a way that's comfortable for them. And Ratchetdemic is a more academic, I would say, comprehensive update to what that looks like. And then we have Culturally Responsive Teaching by Geneva Gay down here, and then Cultivating Genius, which is probably the most current book that's being used in different spaces to talk about culturally relevant education and historical literacy practices. The 2 techniques that I'll briefly talk about, because I'm running out of time, are the co-generative dialogue. I have a YouTube channel where I talk about both of these techniques. So the co-generative dialogue is from Chris Emden, and you basically take a group of diverse students outside of class time, develop a bond with them, feed them, and take feedback from what's going on in class, and you rotate those students throughout the semester, year, however you're with them. And then daily meditations give time for students to process information. I did them after the do now, and it also was a cue for them with music that they liked, that they could connect with. Sometimes we had silent meditations where students can just silently process, but it was a transition period. So they know at the beginning of class is over, now we're going into something else, and I might prompt them to think about something socially, personally, and they could listen to music and just chill out for a bit. The last thing I'll say is that we create the culture. I used this template about America because we are all in an American context, and this is a picture of the Grand Canyon. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. That culture I bring with me to New York City. I brought it to me to California. I brought it to me to Maryland, right? I grew up thinking that everybody had a piñata at their birthday because that's what we did in Arizona, because we have a lot of Hispanic and Mexican culture. That's a part of my culture, right? And so you should understand and believe that there's surface level culture about what person checks on a box, and there's deep culture. You wouldn't necessarily know that I love piñatas by looking at me or me just marking the box that I'm Black and that I'm a Christian or heterosexual, all these things. There's some deep cultural elements there, that I love cartoons, this type of thing. So I'm asking you to be brave in this environment. I'm asking you to take risks in the environment. I'm asking you to fear not and shine bright. The end of our national anthem says, "And the home of the brave." So be brave. Our students are counting on it. It's worth it. And we are the ones who create the culture of America. Thank you so much for listening. You can contact me at these places. Fear not, shine bright. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
So throughout it all, dear teacher, fear not and shine bright.